Hello, my name is Alora, and in this video I'm going to be going over how I made these two different bustle pads. And then I'm also going to be doing a bit of a comparison of them at the end of this video. There's going to be timestamps in the description down below if you have anything in particular that you wanted to check out. But before I get into the creation of these two, I wanted to touch on why I chose them to begin with. First off, I'm trying to recreate an 1890s silhouette, so I started off by finding images that depicted the silhouette of the time, and while drawings are nice, they can easily be exaggerated to show an unrealistic shape. So instead, I tried to focus my search on photographs of the actual women wearing their actual clothes of the time, and here are a few images that I found useful. The thing that I was really paying attention to was the expansion of their clothing directly under the waistline in the back. So once I had an idea of the kind of shape I was trying to achieve, I wanted to check what the actual desired measurement for my body should be at the hip. And so I went back and I looked at various patterning books and checked my waist measurement to see what the corresponding hip measurement should be about. And that number came to about 40 inches. So the next trick is to figure out what that measurement is on me naturally. And when I say naturally, I do mean that measurement taken over under things, because that's how the measurement would have been taken historically. And that led to a whole nother issue, because in modern clothing, the term hip measurement is a little nondescript. Are we talking about a high hip here? Are we talking about around the bum? It could mean several different things. So I turned to the trusty Keystone guide, and it states that this measurement is taken 6 inches below the natural waist. Always easy and smoothly around. Perfect. So the next step is to actually measure that point. So I did. And what I found is that I'm actually 41 inches. Okay, so you might be thinking this means that I don't actually need a bustle. You would be incorrect. While the hip measurement is correct, the slope from the waist to that hip is not ideal, which apparently was a pretty common problem in the era. In the Cook County Herald in 1898, there's an article that states, "The bustle is as light as a feather and is fastened to the corset just below the waistline, where a hollow is generally seen in the average figure." So it looks like I have the issue that the average figure would have. And indeed, when I looked at Google Patents, there are a lot of patents submitted in this era that are just small little bustles intending to fill in that hollow below the waist. There were small ones with ties and other ones that hooked directly onto the corsets. And of course there were larger ones that expanded the sides of the body, not just the back, though those ones were a little less relevant to my particular needs. I narrowed down my search with the consideration of ventilation, which ultimately led me to choosing these two. And while they're not from the exact year range I was looking for, I am very optimistic that they are going to give me the correct silhouette. The first one is from 1908, and it was submitted by Theodore J Wall. And in it he states that the object of this invention is to produce a bustle, or distender, of this character, which is light and washable, and which is constructed to permit of free ventilation, thereby rendering the same more comfortable to the wearer, owing to the absence of any heating effects, and also rendering the same perfectly sanitary. And I really like the idea of this one because it is easily washed. No stuffing or stiffening to worry about. The second bustle is from 1906 by, and please forgive me because I am about to butcher this name, Freda Kuebler? Or maybe Freda B Kuebler? Yeah, no, I got nothing. But in his patent, he states that my invention relates to an improvement in bustles, and particularly relates to the construction of an article of that description which shall be reversible, adjustable, and light, and shall have the provision for the ready passage of air therethrough. I found this one interesting because of the way that the ventilation holes work. There are no grommets here, but ventilation holes all the same. I quite like the concept of both of these bustles, and I think that they'll suit my purposes perfectly. So now it's time to break down the patents and let's get sewing.
This one is a very interesting bustle because it's made exclusively out of tapes that are connecting ruffles together. There is no solid piece that the ruffles are connected to. Though I suppose you could just attach the ruffles to a solid piece if you wanted to, and in the patent he does explain that that is an option, but that's not really what I want to do because I feel like it would negate the ventilation aspect. So my first task was to figure out how much to enlarge this pattern by. I decided that I wanted it to be 8 inches from edge to edge, simply because 8 inches is about 1/3 of my waist measurement, and that would prevent it from overflowing onto the sides of my waist, just filling in that hollow in the back as needed. I just enlarged the pattern until it was that size, and then I traced the placement of the tapes from the patent to make this new pattern piece, which I'm showing you here over this 1-inch marked grid. So in case you're interested in recreating this yourself, hopefully you can figure out how to make the pattern with this image. Once I had done that, the next thing to do was to actually make the tapes that the ruffle would attach to. It is the next morning and I am about to get started on the ruffle bustle, and I remembered that I actually have some bias binding in my stash. I have not ever had use for this, and now I finally do. So, the problem with it is actually that it is double the width of what I need. So what I've done is simply cut out pieces to about the length I think I'll need, give them a little extra room to be safe, and then just cut it in half and make half-width pieces. So it ends up looking like this. I literally just cut it in half and then refolded it so it's exactly the same as the wider piece, just half the width. And as it is bias binding, so the weave is going diagonally on the cut instead of going with the cut, this means that I can easily manipulate it on a curve, which is perfect for this project. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how I do that. I'm coming at you with a quick little safety tip real quick. Please be careful if you're using your iron on paper. I do not want to be responsible for anyone catching their house on fire. So, you know, just be cautious. That's all. Another thing to note is that while I am ironing the bias tape, I am being very cautious about not stretching the tape. So I'm lifting the iron up and putting it down each time instead of dragging it across, because that can cause it to stretch in odd ways, which we want when we are shaping it for the actual bustle, but we don't want when we are just ironing in the folds. The next thing to do is to cut out all of the strips that will be the ruffles. And I'm doing this by measuring those tapes and then I double that measurement. So this bottom edge is 12 inches, so I'm marking out 24 inches on the fabric, and I am making the bottom ruffle 2 inches wide because the patent shows that that bottom ruffle is slightly larger than the 3 central ruffles. And then I just go ahead and cut out that strip, being 24 inches by 2 inches. Then when I do the 3 central ruffles, I'm actually doing them the same thing. So the length of the tape, in this case 8.5 inches, double it, which turns it into 17 inches. But then I mark 1 3/4 inch away from the edge to make a strip that is the correct length by 1 3/4 wide for those 3 central ruffles. Also, the fabric that I am using is a little bit heavier weight than a muslin. I'm not entirely sure what this is, as I did not actually buy it. I inherited this, and I'm fairly certain that it is a cotton, but it's a little bit stiffer, and I think that will work better, so the ruffles will be less likely to be squashed by the weight of the skirts. You can see me doing the next step here, which is to finish the ends of the bias binding that I'm going to be using down the center of the bustle. I'm doing that just by rolling the edges in and giving them a quick press. The next thing I do uses that pattern piece one more time, and I simply align the binding strips with their marks on the pattern, and then use pins to indicate where the binding should stop in accordance with the pattern. I do this on all 3 of those central pieces, as well as the top edge of the outside ruffle. And then I just use the iron again to press where those edges need to actually stop. Once this is done, I align it one more time with the pattern to make sure that I have got all of the edges stopping where they need to stop. And once I am done with that, I move on to the actual ruffles. I trim off 2 of the corners and then start the first roll on 3 of the edges. Again, I'm just rolling it with my fingers, making that roll as small as possible. It's about 1/8 of an inch. And then once I have the first roll in those 3 edges, I go back and I roll a second time in all 3 of those edges. I repeat this process with all of the ruffles. At which point, they can all make a trip to the sewing machine. And I'm just going around all 3 of those rolled edges on all of those pieces and stitching that down so I don't have to worry about fraying. Once that is done, I actually change my stitch size to the largest that my machine will let me, and just do 2 rows of basic basting stitches along the top edge, so the edge that is not rolled on each of those ruffles. I make sure to leave nice long tails of thread on either side so I can use them to gather the ruffles. On one side, I take all 4 of those threads, put a knot in them, and trim the excess. On the other side, I use those loose threads to pull against the fabric, causing it to gather up on itself. Periodically checking with the bias tapes to see if they have been gathered adequately. And then once it seems that they are, I simply tie a knot in those 4 threads again on the other side so the ruffles don't come undone while I pin them inside of the bindings. Once all of the ruffles are pinned into their corresponding bindings, they all get another trip to the sewing machine. At this point, all that's left is the actual assembly. So using that pattern piece that I made from the beginning, I once again lay everything out and just pin it all together where the points are supposed to meet. So you can see how I've pinned everything on, and I've just actually pinned this down to my ironing board so that it doesn't move around too much, because I'm going to be stitching these together by hand. So please excuse my rather sad hand stitching. It is a skill of which I am still learning. And, of course, this whole process would probably go a little bit smoother if I didn't have a kitten helper. Now, I didn't get any footage of the very last step, but it's fairly simple. I just hand stitch on some ribbons to use for ties. And it's done. Now it's time to move on to the second bustle. This is, of course, assuming that Aya will let me. Again, I'm starting with the image from the patent itself, and I'm just enlarging it. I made it closer to 9 inches rather than the last one's 8, just assuming that once it's stuffed, it's going to shrink a little bit. And you can see it is a 5-panel pattern. It has the piece in the center, and then the 2 pieces on the left will just be symmetrical on the right. And you can see these kind of markings that I have on the edges between the 2. That is because each of these little tube kind of guys is going to get top stitched on that edge 3/8 of an inch in from the edge. This is to give me a flat area that I can use to stitch over, connecting the different panels. Now these panels only connect at the top and the bottom. They are left detached in the center for a couple inches so that when the stuffing is inserted, it'll expand and pull away from each other, causing those little ventilation points in the center between each panel. I hope all of that made sense, but with any luck, seeing it constructed will allow you to make a lot more sense of this part. So when this one is unfolded, you can see how it has dotted lines 1/4 inch away from the edge on either side. And this is where you can just line up those edges and stitch and then flip it inside out so it will create a tube. So if you are also interested in making this bustle pad, hopefully these images will give you a starting place for making your own pattern. Now that I have all the pattern pieces, the first step is, as always, to trace and cut out the pieces. You can see the edge pieces. I'm actually cutting on the fold. Now you can see here all of the pieces have been cut out, and I've ironed them the way that they will be in the end, so you can kind of get an idea of what it all will look like. The next thing I did was just to put a few large pad stitches on these edge pieces to make sure that they don't shift while sewing. Yeah, again, please excuse my not great hand stitching skills. I am just going to take all of these central pieces and pin them with the edges together so that I can take them to the sewing machine and sew them into tubes. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, as that's what I marked on the pattern. I'm just going to iron those seams open, trying not to put any other folds in this tube, before I flip it inside out and give it a proper iron on the correct side, making sure that that center seam is truly in the center of the little tube that has been created. And here are all of the pieces once again. The next step is to stitch along each of those folded lines. I do this 3/8 of an inch away from the edge on all 5 pieces wherever there is a fold. Now you can see how I have these pieces lined up on top of each other so that the stitched portions overlap, and then I just go back to those pattern pieces again and mark the points where I need to stitch to. So I'm going to stitch the top inch and the bottom about 2 inches of each of these panels to each other so that they are overlapping as I am showing here. And this, while I could do it by machine, I'm still trying to practice that hand stitching, so I decided to do it by hand. And I will admit my stitching is not perfect, but you know, we all have to start somewhere. And I get the impression that hand sewing is going to be something that will take many hours of practice before I can truly be proud of my results. Now I'm using the same bias tape that I used for the other bustle, and simply cutting it in half to make bias tape half the width of the original bias tape. I made sure it was long enough to go around that curved outside edge of the bustle, and then, again assuming the kittens will let me, I ironed and pinned it into place along that outside edge. Back to the sewing machine to stitch the binding into place. And then I can remove those large pad stitches that I used to hold the edge pieces in place. There's definitely a satisfying feeling about picking these guys out. I'm just using some polyfill to fill these in because that is what I had on hand. And I'm using my awl to kind of really get in there and help smooth it all into place and really stuff those panels quite densely. Once the panel is fully stuffed, I simply put a pin at the top to hold it all in place. Now before I do the final panel, I realized that something didn't quite look right. Going back to the original patent design, it seems like that center panel actually has a stitch that goes down the center of it, turning it into two little stuffed channels. So another trip to the sewing machine, and I simply stitched in the ditch of that seam in the back. And I really appreciate how that worked. That stuffing really pulled those edges apart, giving those little ventilation spots. To be honest, while I was stuffing it, I wasn't convinced that this was going to turn out quite like the patent depicted. Now, using the other half of that binding strip that I made earlier, I just attached that to the top edge of the bustle. Now, I didn't get any footage of it, but just like I did on the first bustle, I simply attached some ribbons to the ends of the bustles to allow me to tie it on. And there you have it, 2 Edwardian bustles. Now, let's see how they do making a late Victorian silhouette. Starting with the ruffle bustle, I will say I do quite like the silhouette it provides. And you can see it here with a petticoat over the top, and I feel like it is just perfect. It really adds to the expansion below the waistline without being so much that you have like a shelf. And same thing goes for the filled bustle. I really do love the way that this looks underneath a petticoat. I feel like it is the perfect silhouette. And I did measure all of these at that hip point after I padded out the mannequin to be my size, and these bustles did not impact the hip measurement at all. And you can kind of tell by looking at the bustles how the bottom edge of the bustle actually ends above the bottom edge of the corset. So it's not adding any volume down where that hip measurement is taken.
So now it is time for my thoughts on these 2 bustles. To be entirely honest, I think they both provide excellent shape, exactly what I was looking for, increasing the angle of expansion from the waist without increasing the hip measurement. I didn't see a whole lot of difference in the silhouette provided by either of them, and I honestly quite like them both. But let's talk about practicality. Having the stuffing in this one is probably going to make me less likely to wash it regularly, and despite the ventilation holes, I have a theory that when wearing this all day in summer, on hot days, it would still probably lead me to sweating more than wearing the little ruffled bustle. So that's probably going to make me less likely to wear it in the warmer months. And while this little ruffly guy would be perfect for the warmer months, the thing to keep in mind is that the shape provided is all from these little ruffles. And while I love how washable that makes it, I am a little concerned that when wearing thicker skirts, and in winter, with all of the rain that we get here, those skirts being heavy and potentially heavy and wet, these ruffles might end up getting a little flattened, and thus the shape provided would be reduced. So where that shape is perfect in warmer months with lighter skirts, it might not be the best in winter. Whereas bustle number 2 is stuffed really quite full, its shape will not be impacted by heavier skirts. So ultimately, I think I have found my ideal summer bustle and winter bustle. I hope that if you are at all interested in bustles or potentially about to start your own bustle making journey, that this was helpful to you. If so, maybe consider hitting that thumbs up button down below. And next week, I am actually going to be making a petticoat to go along with these bustles. So you can subscribe if you would like to know when that video comes out. I hope you all have a lovely day, and I will see you next week.